Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. What a delight it is to see so many of you here in the room on this lovely sunny afternoon. Here in Geneva, but also online, I believe we have about 60 people listening in, so welcome to those of you who are online. Thank you for attending our Geneva Security Debate on how AI will transform the world, the need for a new strategic compass. It's one of our 23rd security debates. So we've been very busy this year. We've had almost two Geneva Security Debates a month. So we're working hard. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Christina Shori-Liang. I'm head of counterterrorism and preventing violent extremism here at the GCSP, and I'm also an adjunct faculty member at the Paris School of International Affairs, Sciences Po. AI has become the world's hottest technology. The mainstream AI debate is dominated by futuristic visions of utopia and dystopia, and several governments are interested in its use to facilitate both their political power and their military power, as well as, of course, their military dominance. Unsurprisingly, for multiple states, especially great powers, AI has become an existential priority. Accordingly, AI is increasingly framed as winner takes all, a struggle really for planetary dominance in this field. Although most of the stakeholders have expressed a commitment to regulation to ensure AI for good, the global government's discourse remains very challenging. Today, we will briefly focus on AI's practical implications, how it has evolved over the years, focusing on some of the milestones. We will then discuss how AI will impact our lives, from intelligence and privacy to algorithms and job security, as well as to autonomous weapons and existential threats. We will also delve into the geopolitics of AI. Currently, the US and China are leading the AI revolution. Both these countries choose to compete and are not willing to cooperate as much as they should. And AI will have really dramatic consequences for both global economics and global governance. Finally, we will discuss what is being done at the national and mostly at the global level to improve the safety of advanced AI. So I am delighted to have here two esteemed speakers, Professor Richard Aldrich and Dr. Jean-Marc Rickley. Let me now begin to introduce our speakers, beginning with Professor Richard Aldrich. He is the professor of international security at the University of Warwick. In 2019, he completed a Leavenworth Major Research Fellowship to investigate the nature of secrecy in a world characterized by increasing technology and transparency. And he has recently been involved in the Age 2020 DigiGen project and an EU Erasmus project on cyber diplomacy. His main research interests lie in the area of intelligence and security communities. And while his most recent research has been a joint work with J.D. Work, his name, where he has focused on Project Spaceman. He looks at the pioneering British efforts in the area of computer security and automatic data processing in the 1970s. He has written several books. Among them are The Hidden Hand, Britain, America, and Cold War, Secret Intelligence, as well as, I have to say it, Crown, Cloak, and Dagger, the British Monarchy, and Secret Intelligence, from Victoria to Elizabeth II. Dr. Jean-Marc Rickley is head of Global and Emerging Risks and founder and director of the Polymath Initiative here at the GCSP. He is also co-chair of the NATO Partnership for Peace Consortium of Defense Academies and Security Studies Institute's Emerging Security Challenges Working Group. And he also represents the GCSP in the UN in the framework of the Government Group of Experts on Lethal Autonomous Weapons Systems. And he is author of a fantastic book on surrogate warfare, the transformation of war in the 21st century. And with that brief introduction now, I will begin with some slides, some introductory slides I hope to stick to 8 minutes, but hopefully the slides are coming up. I will talk about how AI will transform the world, the need for a new strategic compass. I believe we are sleeping on a volcano. Alexis de Tocqueville said that in 1848 when he mentioned when he addressed the French Parliament and he was highlighting the unrest in Paris. He said, I believe we are sleeping on a volcano knowingly and believing that Europe was faced with revolution. It was basically centuries of social order structures disintegrated in months, from Prussia to Paris and from Berlin to Bucharest. All Europe was in disarray. We are indeed at an inflection point, at the cusp of something momentous, and how we deal with it will equally have repercussions for centuries to come. So we have no time to waste. Our volcano, can you guess? Has erupted on November 2022 as ChatGPT was launched. It gained over 200 million users in I believe, 2 months. So we are living now in an AI world. We are no longer talking about emerging, we are in it. Artificial intelligence is the simulation of human intelligence processes by machines and especially computer systems. The term AI was coined in the 1950s, and it encompasses an evolving wide range of technologies that aim to simulate human intelligence, including machine learning and deep learning. Machine learning enables software to autonomously learn patterns and predict outcomes by using historical data as input. However, deep learning is a subset of machine learning, and it aims to mimic the brain structure using layered neural networks. It underpins many major breakthroughs and recent advances in AI, including autonomous vehicles and ChatGPT. 4 waves of AI applications have been identified by Kai-Fu Lee. It's starting already in 2010 with the Internet AI, which created websites, apps, advertising, games, and entertainment, as well as e-commerce. The second wave came in 2014 with business AI, financial services, education, public services, medical logistics. And then wave 3 in 2016 with perception AI, security, retail, energy, the Internet of Things, smart homes, smart cities. And the wave 4 in 2018 with autonomous AI, with agriculture, manufacturing, robotics, transportation, especially autonomous vehicles. So what is artificial intelligence going to bring us? It's going to bring us a lot. It holds a lot of promise, of course, also of a lot of dangers ahead, but it will bring enhanced security in many different fields, including cybersecurity. It can help respond to cyber threats in real time. It will help in surveillance and monitoring. It will help in fraud detection. It will also improve our healthcare. If you look at disease diagnosis and management, AI can really assist in early diagnosis and can even have personalized treatment plans. And telemedicine will change the world in the sense that more and more people will have access to healthcare. AI will also create better economics. We will have more increased productivity, more innovation. We will work a lot more efficiently in operations. It will optimize our supply chains and production process and resource management. So it has a lot of promises. In terms of environmental sustainability, AI promises to help in climate change mitigation. It helps to monitor and manage environmental changes, predicting natural disasters. It will also help us with smart agriculture and energy management. Education will also be increasingly changed by AI. We will have personalized learning to students across the world. More people will have access to education, and education tools will be greatly improved with AI. And finally, public services, especially smart cities. AI will optimize traffic management, waste management, public safety. It will help increase quality of life in urban life. It will also help in e-government in terms of better decision making, leading to more transparency, more responsive government. And in terms of disaster response, AI will help us to predict and analyze disasters in the future. It will also help us to coordinate relief efforts and use our resources more efficiently. ChatGPT is now so advanced that humans can't reliably tell whether they are actually talking to other people or not. And we're going to hear more about that in a brief while with Professor Aldrich. But in March 2023, there was an important moment. 33,000 scientists, startups, founders, and corporate leaders signed an open letter calling for a 6-month moratorium on training powerful AI systems due to their risks to humanity. And one of the biggest fears we have in the AI world, and we're going to talk about all the different challenges, but it's really the idea of containment. The surge or the wave of AI could flood us, could overcome, could be a huge challenge to our humanity and to the way we live. There are several reasons why I wanted to show this slide. It's because historically, in history and in mythology, every culture has always had a story about a flood from the Hopi Indians in the American Southwest to the Incas in the Peruvian Andes. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, to Noah's Ark, to Plato. Plato even talked about how the lost city of Atlantis was engulfed in a torrent. And I really look at this AI as a revolution, as in a way a flood. We are flooded by its asymmetrical impact. It will create new unthinkable vulnerabilities. It's hyper-evolution. The technology is spreading faster than ever before. It's evolving, improving, and branching into new areas at an incredible speed that we can't really control yet. Hopefully, we'll discuss this in more detail. And finally, the omni-use. The technologies that AI can unleash can be used for many different purposes, good and bad. And we will highlight those for you today. At the same time, people are talking about a moratorium, but it's going to be very difficult to do that because we are at the same time in a geopolitical world challenge, and I will get to that in a second. But here we can see at least some positive developments in the development of AI. The EU has introduced the Artificial Intelligence Act. China has the new Shanghai regulations. The US has a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. The AI Seoul Summit, which I think is the most detailed and most useful, has created an international scientific report on the safety of advanced AI. And then, of course, OpenAI's recent planning for AGI and beyond. So there is already work in that field, and we're going to talk about that also later today. But at the same time, we are in the middle of a geopolitical crisis in a sense that we see the competition between China and the US really growing. There's declining trade flows, there's escalating ship wars, there's an arms buildup in the world, and this is really changing and worrisome in terms of the geopolitical realm. We're going to talk about that in more detail when we talk about the last segment of our debate. But geopolitical tensions are really on the increase. And this is during a time when we are flooded by AI, so the two will be difficult. This is a chart that I try to think of how we can create guardrails, or how can we make a safer AI, and how at the same time can we ensure that all people can profit from AI. I have to be honest to you, I showed this chart to Professor Aldrich, and he said, that's really hopeful thinking. But at the same time, I think this is really what we want to do, is we have to build strategic leadership in order to build a strategic compass on how to deal with AI, because it's really paramount. In 2020, there was a really good paper that came out that looked at all the positive and negative impacts of AI on the Sustainable Development Goals. And you can see the positive is the big green patch there, and it looks very hopeful. But the little yellow patch is also growing, and that's the negative parts of AI on the Sustainable Development Goals. So all is not all well. However, on the 21st of March, the UN General Assembly adopted a landmark resolution on the promotion of safe, secure, and trustworthy AI. So it's already being discussed and debated. And of course, in Geneva here, we just had a couple weeks ago, the AI for Good Summit in Geneva, and they actually came up with they announced that one of their pledge drives between Partner 2 Connect and AI for Good, which was launched by the ITU Secretary General, was able to raise $1.76 billion to promote digital inclusion, particularly for people with disabilities, young girls and women. And they hope to develop more sustainable, inclusive digital economies by promoting more access to technologies through infrastructure development, upskilling, and assistance. So it's not all worrisome, but at the same time, a lot of organizations like the UN, like the EU, like governments like in China and the US are stepping up, trying to find ways to deal with this new flood of technology. I just wanted to give that as a sort of introductory points to the debate. But now I'm going to pass the floor to Professor Richard Aldrich, who will continue the conversation on AI and how he sees AI and the flood of how it's overwhelming our society.
I think that artificial intelligence genuinely is one of the great challenges of our time. It's not just a challenge for security, it's a challenge for trade, diplomacy, international organizations. And one of the effects of AI is one of the things that technology does is it breaks down boundaries. And what we're seeing is military ideas, securitization, spilling into all sorts of other spaces. And so almost everything with a technical component, and in 3 years' time, that's going to be my fridge. It's going to be impossible for me to buy a fridge that doesn't connect to the internet. A toaster, who cares about these? These things can be weaponized in a world of AI. We're seeing war becoming everything and everything becoming war. So this is a really profound effect that AI is having on every human being on the planet. So I think it's really important that we're getting together to discuss this today. So I'd like to just take us through some little kind of, initially maybe begin with a definition. Because it's interesting that we talked about ChatGPT and how people mistake this for human beings. This takes us to the early classical definition of artificial intelligence. More than 50 years ago, Alan Turing said, we need a test. It's actually called the Turing test. A test of artificial intelligence will be a machine that can mimic a human being so well that the human being thinks that this is actually another human being. And I think for decades, the Turing test was kind of seen as our definition of AI. But more recently, John McCarthy, often thought of as the father of AI, defines AI differently. He says, actually, this anthropomorphic definition of AI is no longer fit for purpose. It may be that higher forms of intelligence than us will not look human in terms of form, the way it thinks. We have to reconceptualize AI. It won't necessarily be human-centric. And you may find that very optimistic. You may find that very pessimistic, depending on your point of view. The other definition that I think is helpful today is the distinction between general AI and narrow AI. So general AI is something that philosophers are very engaged with at the moment. They're debating the future of, if you like, the Terminator kind of intelligence, the singularity. We're now, I'm happy to say, still in the field of narrow AI, even if ChatGPT sometimes sounds a little bit like general AI. It's not. It's fooling us. It's still kind of narrow natural language processing. I think it's also helpful just to talk about the authors, because all sorts of people have piled in on this subject. I think we can broadly identify 4 schools of thought. We can talk about the optimists, people who are really, really sunny about the future of AI. And these people, and Ray Kurzweil would be an example, are people who talk about the health benefits. And I think the health benefits are some of the most persuasive cases for pushing ahead with AI, not regulating, not restricting. In fact, the optimists are really worried that people like us, the security people, will introduce all sorts of bad stuff, and that will lead to moratoria, that will lead to restrictions, regulations. So the optimists are really keen to press ahead. Then there's what I would call the warriors, particularly in the United States and China, people who see this as an existential struggle. And this is because AI often has these network effects, concentration. Sometimes in colloquial language, we call it winner takes all. And in a world of winner takes all, China and the United States feel they can't hold back because this is effectively a race for everything. Then you have the skeptics, people who are just a bit skeptical about the transformative power of AI. And finally, the pessimists, who are really gloomy about the outcomes. And I'm proud to say that I'm a pessimist. I'm in school number 4. So now just some sort of overview, things that we might have time to talk about some of these today. What are the wider challenges of AI? Job losses. I think we're now beginning to see the shakeout of AI in the world of employment. Wealth disparity, financial instability. We all remember 2008. Discrimination, lack of transparency, even in health, a move away from the human touch in terms of caring for other human beings. The problem of regulation, AI moving so fast that even as the EU introduces its 2023 AI law, it's being left behind by the new advances. Environmental costs. Training AI is incredibly expensive in terms of power and water and heating, and of course the global south disparity. Some really big, wider challenges. And I think sometimes when we're thinking about AI, we tend to neglect some of these wider issues, particularly north-south, as we chase down the kind of issues of American-Chinese competition. And then more specific security issues, obviously AI arms racing, social control, the way in which China is exporting really worrying technologies to places like Zimbabwe, electoral manipulation, countries like the Philippines, even the United States, seeing examples of this. The problem that data that already exists, when it's subjected to AI analysis, reveals all sorts of things that we didn't expect it to reveal. So threats to privacy, threats even to government secrecy. Effects on the Internet of Things. I've already talked about my fridge, my worries about the safety of my cheese supply. More seriously, cloud security is increasingly dependent on AI. And so as we aggregate our data behind an AI wall, when that's successful, that's great, but when it fails, the potential losses and catastrophes are huge. The effect on encryption, including the stability of nuclear command and control systems. The big one is the gradual slipping of the control of strategic technologies away from states, away from military bureaucracies, away from people on national security councils to the big techs. I think for me, one of the most interesting essays, the must-read of the last 5 years, was Ian Bremmer's Technopolar Moment, talking about the rise of the big techs, talking about the failure of people like me in international relations to think about a theory that would allow us to imagine Google, Nvidia, Microsoft as essentially superpowers on the world stage. We don't have a language, we don't have a set of theories that allow us to think this through, and that's one of the challenges ahead of us.
Thank you so much, Richard. I'm going to now pass the floor to Jean-Marc quickly. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And so I'll talk a bit more about what we already see in terms of the security implications of artificial intelligence. And again, AI has a lot of potential for doing good. And Christina referred to the ITU's AI for Good Summit. There are lots of people thinking about the positive application of AI to actually improve the way humanity lives. But there is also a dark side, because this technology can also be leveraged for bad purposes. So if you could just put it right. Okay, so if we look at the security implications, so looking at what we have now, you can basically already identify 3 clusters where AI has an impact. The first one is espionage and surveillance, because what we have seen over the last 10 years is really the rise of specific technique of artificial intelligence, so machine learning and deep learning. And what this technique is really good at is inferring patterns based on data. So, based on what we are witnessing now, for instance, in Ukraine, Ukraine have some problems with the air defense system. And what Ukraine reveals in terms of the future of conflict is that every individual citizen needs sensors, because you are gathering, generating data. And if you know how to tap into this data, then you can basically use this data for intelligence purposes. So the Ukraine, for instance, developed an application that any Ukrainians could download to identify, flying objects, and then take a pictures that would then be sent to a central server where AI would identify what this object is, geolocate where it is, and so you can beef up your air defense system. Also get inspired by the private sector with Uber type of application, but instead of linking the customer with the driver, they link the Ukraine unit with the Russian unit on the field. More recently, we've seen that Israel is using artificial intelligence to identify targets, so to generate targets, so as to treat them, and that they are relying on an algorithm. And so here, what is interesting is how this algorithm is coming up with a target designation. So it has to do with what kind of data this algorithm is tapping into. So in terms of intelligence, we see really a big booster and changes in how AI is influencing that field. As Richard was referring before, you can also use AI then to monitor your population, and China has been doing that since the early 2000s. And with development in CCTV cameras, it became increasingly possible with facial recognition to also identify your behavior that is not just online but also offline. And then you can basically create a system where you would assess a population, and based on the behavior of individuals, you can score them, and if the behavior is outside of what you want, then you can reduce their freedom of maneuver. And it's a very effective way to actually induce people to adopt specific behavior without using firm. And as was mentioned earlier, that system is being exploited. So as soon as you have such an ecosystem that develop, you have obviously lots of startups that's starting to work in the field. And so Clearview AI, this business model is, we should gather all the pictures that we can find online. They started with 3 billion pictures. They are now they have more now than 10 billion pictures. They aim at 100 billion pictures. And what they created was an application that anyone can download. And if you, originally not anyone, it was restricted to law enforcement agencies and some companies, but obviously you can never guarantee that it cannot be used elsewhere. And you take a picture of someone and then you run it through the application, and this application will tell you who the person is. So basically, they created a portable intelligence agency application. And in Switzerland, we had an issue 3 years ago where 2 police officers downloaded this application. We had a problem with the legal basis because we don't have that kind of legal basis to deal with that. So this application was also, and has been used also in Ukraine to identify Russian soldier, for instance. The other issue, security implications, is in the field of manipulation. And here you have the development of what we call deepfake from, the time the technology was invented to pretty much now. And you can see by 2018, deepfake became really, really hyper-realistic. And so in a matter of less than 10 years, we moved from having nothing to having a very credible deepfake. And the one in the middle is Vladimir Putin's calling for a mass mobilization and introduction of martial law. So here, again, as a military analyst, you have to factor in that in 10 years from now, you will have to deal with something that did not exist when you are actually thinking about that. Obviously, generative AI, Christina mentioned ChatGPT, has been definitely a tipping point where these tools are very powerful to generate deepfake. And here in Gaza, for instance, you have this picture that also made it to the front cover of a major newspaper in France. And this is this picture. And this picture is a deepfake. And you can spot different issues that are not right. And if you don't believe me, that picture was already tweeted in January of last year when there were earthquakes in Syria and Turkey. And generative AI can be used now to any kind of purposes. This experiment was conducted last year where in an hour using ChatGPT for potential pandemic pathogens were identified where we can actually synthesize them. Then the last thing is that it's not only online. Increasingly, it is moving beyond just digital behavior, but also into military robotics with what we call swarms. So swarms are the aggregation of single unit to create something. And here, for instance, you have commercial swarm, and increasingly fireworks are being prohibited. They're replaced by that kind of thing. So swarms, but swarms can also be used in the military. And so here the idea in the military is to saturate your enemy's defense system. And so you're combining mass firepower, speed, and concentration of forces. So what we have seen over the last 2 years, for instance, be it in Ukraine or in Gaza, is increasingly the use of loitering munition, drones that are able to actually identify sort target, loiter over a specific area, and either a pre-programmed target has been established, or they can actually try to identify specific signals. And so, for instance, here you have the effects of such uses in Ukraine, where in 9 months, the Russians have managed to deeply disrupt the electrical grid in Ukraine. And loitering munitions are have been used already in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Here you have a drone that identify air defense station, and then it just dive into it and explodes. All right, but this type of capabilities are no longer restricted to the military. Increasingly, they are being built upon commercial technology, dual-use technology. ISIS, for instance, in 2017, weaponized commercial drones, and during the Battle of Mosul, up to 30 Iraqi soldiers lost their life on a weekly basis. It's the first time that a non-state actors in military history has the upper hand in terms of air supremacy. And increasingly, get ready to also have a new new types of drones entering the market, and drones that can be weaponized. As you can see, you don't need to invest a lot to weaponize these drones. And increasingly, when you add that, you add additive manufacturing, you can basically engineer drones that can have several payloads. So the big elephant in the room is, okay, whether machines will be able to kill autonomously. This is the work that is being done at the government group of experts on lethal autonomous weapons system at the UN. Shall the international community ban the development of these drones? And this group has been discussing that for the last 10 years. But have not reached any consensus so far. But in the last 10 years, technology has evolved dramatically to the point now that drones could be on the verge of, being able to kill autonomously. So I will conclude with these slides, not just to promote the book, but what you have to understand is that the way we have conceived warfare in the West was highly based on Clausewitz and this so-called trinity, the relationship between the army, government, and citizen. Increasingly, because of the rise of autonomy, technology has to be factored in as an actor in itself. And so this basically leads to governments, and not just governments, states and non-state actors, to use technology as a surrogate in the conflicts. So when you want to understand the impact of AI, don't work an analogy like Robocop or Terminator, because they are bad analogies for several purposes. But look at what kind of function an algorithm is performing, and whether this function is actually entering or competing with your own function. And what this graph shows is that increasingly algorithms are competing with key functions that humans are doing, being speech recognition, facial recognition, or others. And so increasingly what we see are algorithms that are able to cram several functions into their task. So here, this is basically, if you want to have meaningful understanding of this technology, is to compare, each time you see a new application, think about, okay, who is basically at risk in terms of competition? Because here what you have is, in a way, unfair competition. We work at a much lower speed than algorithms are able to do. So the more we will cram functions into an algorithm, the more we will get towards something that resembles what my colleagues were referring before, AGI, artificial general intelligence.
Thank you so much, Jean-Marc, for your very, very interesting presentation. It always fills me a bit with dread when I see all the things that can go wrong in the sense of deep fakes and drones, and the fact that all these drones now can be bought on Amazon and are relatively cheap. But at the same time, those drones were the ones that saved Ukraine from being overwhelmed by Russia at the early stages of the war. And we saw Starlink also coming to the rescue to Ukraine. So corporates have actually now a role in war. So I wanted to ask you, Jean-Marc, what do you think should be the role of corporates in war, and how can we manage them to help us with this flood of threats that you've so described so in detail, especially deep fakes, drones, and all the other ideas that you swarms.
Starting the coverage, the satellite coverage that is now providing connection in Ukraine. This is a good example. If you look at that, if you look at satellites orbiting around the Earth, more than half of them are from Starlink, which is one company. and one company basically is able to provide critical infrastructure. So if you look at the latest company that has reached the status of equivalent of the GAFAM, it's NVIDIA. NVIDIA has reached now 3 trillion valuation. It took 30 years for them to reach 1 trillion. 10 months to reach 2 trillion and 3 months to reach 3 trillion. 3 trillion means 3,000 billion. If you compare with states, probably they would be amongst the 5 wealthiest states on Earth. So each of you are using digital technology, and these technology are developed by the private sector. So the private sector de facto is involved into this. So sometimes they could have a direct impact on conflict, as Starlink, because we are using this infrastructure, but also this technology can be repurposed or used by actors in a different way that they were intended to. For instance, if you take 2 technologies that were developed for good, cryptography and blockchain, if you combine the 2, what you get ransomware. All right, and so here you get you get a new risk. So the issue, though, with the governance is that, first of all, these companies do not want to be associated with security because this has an impact on their reputation. And the other issue is that the incentive or the motivation for companies are very different from governments. Government is about providing security, whereas company, it's about making money. So what we saw, you might remember the motto of Silicon Valley, move fast, break things. When you have such, when you're motivated by such an ideology, what you're interested in as a startup owner is to create cash, to generate cash, because cash is king, and if you're running out of cash, you're going bankrupt. On some of this technology, we should think about security by design. We should think first about security. What will be the impact, the security implication of this technology? And so for that, we should completely change the incentive structure of innovation. To what extent, though, is it possible? It's a big question, because that would require from the very beginning, to embed that kind of thinking into developments. And I will finish that. But if you think about ChatGPT, ChatGPT was released by a private company. And at the time, I call it in a blog post on the World Economic Forum website, the first WMD, not weapons of mass destruction, but weapons of mass disinformation. Because what generative AI is doing is generate lots of content that looks highly, highly credible. But if you look in details, the information is wrong. And it turns out now, there was a study conducted very recently. Wired, less than a year ago, in August of last year, published an article where it said that with $400, anyone can create an equivalent for press agency like AFP or Reuters. A very recent study concluded that now in the US, you have more websites that are generated by generative AI that create, if you want, fake media than legitimate media in the US. And now if you look at current status of the US citizen in terms of they face into information, a third of the US population no longer believes in traditional media. 80% of Americans are actually highly doubtful about information they find online. So what it attacks here for democracies is trust in institution. And this is key. This is a major impact of this technology, because without trust, democracies cannot work. Democracies are relying on social contract, trust between citizens and government. And if we undermine that, we're undermining the core of what democracy is all about. Sorry for being a bit long.
Thank you so much. And it's really important. And I really like to also pass the floor to Richard to also chime in on that. But we've seen that the AI algorithms now that have been disseminated by states actively trying to weaken our democracies, changing, using social media, using these social media weapons in a sense to to break down, to build division in our politics. We saw that the way the Russians and the Chinese had an impact on the U.S. elections in 2016. And a lot of people don't really mention how important that was in changing the outcome. And I think sometimes countries are afraid to really say that they have been greatly weakened by these troll farms that the Russians and the Chinese are using to weaken our democracies. We saw the Institute for Economics and Peace did a study, and literally everything that has to do with democratic states, in terms of trust and media, is declining. So I wanted to ask you, Richard, we see how more and more states are swaying elections. They're using social networks, they're using bots, troll farms, to literally weaken our democracies. What can we do now to bring back trust in our democratic systems? How can we ensure that democracy will come back healthy and alive, and that these nation states who really want to break down our democracies and are even pushing our right-wing extremist groups, what can we do about that?
Yes, it's a tall order, isn't it, really? I mean, my own argument here in terms of dealing with all these issues is we actually need a 10-year moratorium on the deployment of AI in every area other than health. And that sounds like a big ask of the international community, but I'd say that actually, most states, even China, are really worried about this stuff. Think about the transformation of China over the last 50 years. What's it done? It's very rapidly turned an agrarian economy into a manufacturing economy. The political stability of China essentially depends on employment. And AI is as big a threat to the social and political structure as China as it is to the structure of our own countries and society. So I think there is potential for doing that. More specifically, coming to the electoral stuff, yes, deep fakes are an enormous threat to our electoral systems, and we haven't even begun to talk about the global south. What is the impact on this in societies where levels of literature are fairly low, really potentially devastating. And I'm sorry to say that it's not just China and Russia that's doing this. The UK, the United States, European countries, lots of countries are engaged in kind of questionable activities. I think one of the answers is to actually strengthen our own democratic and electoral systems. We've been quite kind of lazy about this stuff. Look at the United States. Why was Putin able to intervene so successfully in the 2016 election? Partly because of the Internet Research Agency, but the calculations of the best American political scientists is the Russians only spent about £100 million to intervene successfully in that election. It was partly the precariousness, the lack of reform, the lack of resilience in the American electoral system that allowed the Russians to intervene. Most people conclude successfully that the Russian intervention was very important in 2016. So just making our systems more resilient, more robust would take us quite a long way.
Thank you so much. Jean-Marc, you mentioned NVIDIA, the company that has now put on restrictions for China to buy, but companies in China have stockpiled them and now are literally working on trying to create a similar product. So the race is really on. And in this escalating chip war, how do you see companies vying for power, especially Asian companies versus US companies in the world, in a sense that this is literally becoming a war between tech companies and who will have the most profound or the most useful AI in the future? Is there a way to cool down this challenge that is growing?
I think you have two competition. One is among the tech giants. If you look at OpenAI, it's interesting to see how fast OpenAI has grown into, the traditional actor, Google, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft. And here you definitely have a race to what we were referring to before, AGI. It's no secret that DeepMind is working on DeepMind, so it's the AI branch of Google, is working on artificial general intelligence, but Microsoft, Facebook, and Meta are also working on this. So to enter that market, if you are not among these top companies, it's almost impossible because you don't have the resources, you don't have the human capabilities, and you don't have the data. Then obviously, because of the power that these companies are wielding, and because also not just in terms of computing power, but also in terms of data, this is becoming an issue of national security. In the latest US executive order, I think that algorithms that have reached the capabilities of 10 to the power 26 or 28 flop, so mathematical operation per second, have now will be considered as a matter of national security. So we can see that already in the US, for instance, with the debate around social media and TikTok. And so at the same time, what you see is that, especially since Trump came to power, you see a kind of technological decoupling between the United States, because let's face it, you only have two countries in the world that have the capacity to develop these capabilities and companies, China and the US. And both have realized that they can no longer let the other have access to some technology. So what they're doing is they decouple. So they no longer cooperate. They no longer allow the companies to cooperate with companies or the governments from their competitor. And so what you start to see emerging is a race between and these two. And obviously, companies will become more and more become actors of this. And so what it means for states that are in between, but it means that at one point you will have to choose, because if you will start working with one country, so one company from a specific country, then the other will retaliate and might tell you, okay, we will no longer do business with you. So there will be hard choice to make from countries that are in the middle. But what it means also is that competition is good for innovation, but it means also that what we have seen over the last 30 years, in globalization being opened and transfer of knowledge, this will increasingly be challenged. And science and technology will become probably, and is already becoming, probably the first dimension of international power, because this is basically what is fueling this rapid transformation, technological transformation.
Thank you so much. We see that China is now really increasing its military technologies and in its efforts to also bringing AI into its military. So it's the races between now the US and China in augmenting their military with AI. And I see a real race in terms of on finding AI-enabled technologies in the military. What can, we mentioned companies having an impact, but what else can we do to in this security field to ensure that our technologies will be more effective?
Well, first of all, there is no predetermined path. Government has still agency because they develop regulations, and the EU has developed a set of regulation to basically provide the same rights to European citizens in the physical than in the digital domain. And the EU managed to do that because it has a mass that is enough to force this company to adopt. single governments are not able to do that. But if companies wants to, this company wants to enter the EU market, they have to abide by this. So there is still an issue of agency, and governments can reaffirm the agency by providing regulations that will prevent certain behavior. The issue here is the pace of transformation, and to what extent governments are able, and also international organizations, able to keep up with the pace of this transformation. I was referring before about the GG on laws, where there is still no consensus on a ban, while the technology has improved dramatically in the last 10 years. So now to answer your questions about how can we win this race, it will be about resources, it will be about intellectual talent. But if you look at the ranking now of high impact factors journals, China has now overtaken the US in terms of the producer of academic knowledge. So increasingly science will become a battlefield, you know, and here it's also about developing the capabilities in societies to promote innovation, but we should also promote responsible innovation. And lastly, there is this issue of energy, because these technology are really, really hungry in terms of energy, and we need to factor that in. You know, unless we manage to develop a limited source of energy for fusion, there will be a time where there will be some restrictions. So the race is also there. You know, it's not just about computing; it's also about how you power this thing.
Thank you so much. Kai-Fu Lee wrote two fabulous books, one called AI Superpowers and another one, AI 2014. And he, in his first book, he identified that data was really the oil, the fuel for ChatGPT, for all these AI. Without, the more data you have, the more effective your AI is working. And data will make AI more effective. So data is a really, really important fuel for these new technologies. With all this kind of technology, how can we still work in the intelligence field in terms of secrecy and intelligence in this extremely transparent world? Is privacy dead, and is intelligence on the run?
So I mean, I think we've had, if you like, privacy panics for a very long time. We had a privacy panic when the Snowden stuff came out in June 2013. In fact, you can go back to copies of Time magazine in the 1980s talking about privacy is dead. So privacy has been on the operating table in the emergency room for a long time. I think what's new is that corporate confidentiality and national government secrecy is also now under threat. There's a great book written about this many years ago by someone called David Brin about the coming of transparency for all organizations. And he argued that actually it's going to be great. Okay, individuals won't be able to have privacy, but corporations will be brought under control. So governments won't be able to do bad things. It'd be like living in a nudist camp. And it might be uncomfortable for a day or two, but eventually you kind of get used to it. David Brin's argument works if you have relatively flat ownership of data. But actually, in reality, what we're seeing is very horizontal ownership of data. Very powerful companies, very powerful countries. So actually, I'm quite pessimistic about that landscape. You asked some really interesting questions, certainly, that I'd like to add some footnotes to. I think this issue of decoupling that Jean-Marc raised is really, really fascinating. So important, because it's really about trying to reverse the flow of the international order over the last at least 50 years. When people just talk about, Eric Schmidt says, we're just going to have to decouple. There's going to be some particular technologies that we can't cooperate on. I think this is hugely simplistic talk, because firstly, very difficult to distinguish between what are genuinely strategic aspects of AI and what are kind of more mundane. We've seen the same problems with the EU AI Act. The EU AI Act does this kind of safety approach where AI is put into different categories. But actually, in reality, some quite everyday applications of AI can potentially be very dangerous. The other issue about, as we try and row back on globalization is that actually scientists around the world are deeply integrated. Trying to unpick scientific cooperation between the United States, China, and Europe is impossibly difficult. And actually, scientists are just culturally attuned to sharing information because they find problems puzzling and they love chatting about, they don't have a national security mindset. And the additional problem, of course, is that while, coming to this data issue that you've talked about, yes, it's true that certain corporations, certain countries, only the big ones will have the huge volumes of data and the technical capability to make some of these things. But once they're made, these things can be proliferated. And we think of these things as new, but there's lots of interesting examples in the past. Actually, not Petya, which we talked about, is an example of a sophisticated APT that was developed by one country, but then moved to another country, then another country. And some of these AI applications can also proliferate. So we've got you can see why I'm a pessimist. We've got a whole range of really complex challenges ahead of us.
Thank you so much. We should now try to be a little bit optimistic here. We're going down a really dark path. So to bring it back to building awareness and cooperation on AI, I just wanted to highlight that you have developed this polymath initiative, and you're also working for the NATO Partnership for Peace Consortium on Defense Academies and Security Studies Institutes on emerging security challenges. So what are you doing in order to build greater awareness of AI and how it shapes international security both now and into the future?
Right. So as I mentioned earlier, what is difficult to grasp is the pace of transformation. And the first step to act is being aware of it. So what we are doing today, is part of it, but that's not enough. So then it's the issue of how do you make sense of this? And because this transformation is very rapid, we are faced with an issue of skills, in a sense that those in academia, those people working in academia, are very skilled, very talented people that dig very deep on a single topic. But the type of issues that we're facing here are multifaceted and multi-domain. And so what we need is also a comprehension of the evolution of the whole. And so people that are hyper specialists are not really good at seeing the big picture. So the idea of the Polymath Initiative is really to infuse what we had in the past and we've lost in academia. It's the idea that if you train as a physicist, you should also have some basis in terms of ethics, history, and maybe biology, So the idea of a Polymath Initiative is really to recreate that. That's why we select a researcher in AI, synthetic bio, or neuroscience, and we train into global governance with two objectives. The first one is they become translator towards policymakers so that they could speak a language that policymakers understand, and so policymakers can take decisions that are better tuned to what is being developed, but also become influencer within their own community. And the third effect is also to develop skills that if you want to understand where the field is going, you need to identify weak signals. And it's very difficult to identify weak signals if you are hyper specialist. You need to have a kind of overview of how where the technology is going, but also understanding the international environment you live in, the changing social norms, the cultural wars that are going on out there. And so when you start to bring all these things together, you start to have a picture that is identifying the trends. And the last thing is foresight. The ability, each companies and each institution should invest in foresight. It's not about predicting. It's impossible to predict what will happen in 2, 3, or 5 months, but it's about coming up with possible future, possible scenarios. And when you have identified this scenario, then you walk back and say, well, if scenarios A materializes, what should I do today in order to prevent that from happening, or in order to actually support a specific development?
Thank you so much. So safe, contained technology is like a liberal democracy, not a final end state, but an ongoing process to be fought for and protected. So people in this field have talked about delaying, detecting, and defending. These are some of the ideas about how we can protect against this wave of technology. Jean-Marc mentioned audits. But are there choke points? Are there levers, you think, in the development that we could buy time for regulation, and especially in the defense technologies?
I think national leaders face, in the West, actually face quite a dilemma here, because if you're looking at national security imperatives, if you're looking at the race with China, then you have an interest in favoring consolidation, network effects. You actually want to see the rise of these big companies that can do extraordinary things. But actually, in terms of issues of social justice, economic distribution, wealth disparities, there's a lot of interest in going back to the kind of antitrust legislation that we saw dismantled in the 1970s and 1980s. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that this consolidation and agglomeration of an economic power is not good socially. So there's some real issues, I think, for national leaders in terms of, okay, Starlink might be great for, American national security, but is that kind of agglomeration of power good? There's a lot of evidence to show that some of these big techs aren't actually particularly good for the economic health of nations. So there's some real meta-level questions in front of us in terms of how we kind of address this stuff. The other thing I'd just say is that, in terms of that competition between the United States and China, it's increasingly clear that other countries, Israel, Singapore, India are really important. So for the United States, I think in terms of staying ahead of China, it's going to be not the United States, but the United States and its allies. That in turn has consequences for American foreign policy. That's going to require a more multilateral approach. That in turn has interesting questions about who gets into the White House next year. Some leaders are more multilateral than others. We'll see what happens there.
Thank you so much. You've recently been involved in this H2020 DigiGen project, and also you're working with the EU on the Erasmus project on cyber diplomacy. Could you describe the work that you're doing in this domain? Do you think it's covering enough ground? And are there more steps that are needed in securing more stability?
Well, it's a great question, and it speaks to some of Jean-Marc's comments about kind of expertise. I think it's really important that we move forward all areas of our society in terms of trying to educate and stay. It's a real challenge. It's a challenge in my own university. All sorts of things that we've taught for 50 years now have to have a tech element inserted into them. It's a real challenge in terms of our political leadership, our judiciary. There was a great commentator on technology writing a few years ago called James Norton. and he invented something called Norton's Law. And he said this law states that the higher up you get in any organization, whether it's a university, a parliament, the judiciary, the lower the understanding of technology gets, to the point that when you get to the very top, it's almost zero. And I often, I often remember this, because when we look at our legislators, people in parliament trying to grapple with these really complex things, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. Fascinated to see countries like Singapore actually introducing technical refresher courses into all areas of public life. If you want to be promoted in the bureaucracy, this is wonderful. If you want to be promoted in the bureaucracy in Singapore, you have to pass kind of like a revised driving test in terms of your understanding of technology. A lot of countries doing some really innovative things in this space that perhaps we could learn from.
Thank you so much. And just to add to that, Finland is also spectacular, I think, in its work with the its entire population, trying to build awareness on misinformation, because they've been attacked with misinformation and these bots from Russia for decades, in a sense, and they literally had to build up the resilience within their society. So they not only teach youngsters in courses at school, but also adults, because they are like the most vulnerable, as we have seen, for example, with the QAnon crisis. It's actually not the young people that are falling for these crazy stories. It's actually older people, which is really worrisome, because they're the ones who are making the decisions. So here we have, we've talked about audits, we've talked about technical safety mechanisms, businesses, governments, building alliances across organizations, but also what about arms control agreements? Do you think we could maybe use the type of arms control agreements that we've used in the past to protect us against the rise of nuclear weapons? Is this something that you could see or foresee that we could use in the AI domain?
Well, there are two issues here. First is I don't think we can, because it's very different. Arms control agreements were developed to 50s, 60s, 70s to try to limit the occurrence of war by putting some qualitative and quantitative restriction and development of weapons. It turns out that when you develop nuclear weapons, it's visible. It's very difficult to develop a nuclear weapon in the garage. Look at Iran. Whereas the type of issues we're talking about here is almost invisible. It's a digital domain. So your incentive to free ride are completely different when it is when you compare to traditional arms control, nuclear arms control agreement. Because if the international community or an external power is unable to monitor what you're doing, what are your incentives to actually respect the agreement? So this is a major issue, and therefore we need to completely rethink also what escalation and crisis escalation means in this field, because we are very much we know, if you take the current missile crisis, here. First, it is visible and it has been induced by that individual. Increasingly, what we will see also is machine-to-machine interaction. How do you model machine-to-machine interaction? We have very few examples. The only field I could think of in terms of crisis escalation in this field is high-frequency trading. In the 80s, we introduced algorithm into trading floors, and suddenly you have flash crashes. A flash crash is basically a different way. It's a crisis escalation, but that is built on different rations that we human beings are thinking about. So this is a problem. The other issue is that if you look at this discussion, we are not, probably little numbers open system are not maybe the most important danger, but what we've seen is the impact that disinformation has on on democracies, how it undermines trust. And here, in a paper that we co-wrote with my colleagues at GCSP last year, we called for the international community to come up with subversion control regime, because increasingly these tools are being used to undermine legitimate authorities, and there is absolutely no regulation on this. And subversion is being propelled and fueled by generative AI, but increasingly it will also be fueled by a new type of technology, neurotechnology, technology that is connecting the brain with the machine and that collects new types of data, neurodata. And so the more we move into that space, the more we'll have to be very careful about how this technology can be used and weaponized. So yes, we should rethink arms control agreement, but we also come up with this new concept of subversion control.
Thank you so much. We also wanted to just briefly talk about lethal autonomous weapon systems. We see more and more now that these are part of warfare. You wrote a book on surrogate warfare, and you talked about this. What I'm worried about is if we digitalize war, in a sense that war will no longer be fought by men and women, but by machines, will be more willing to go to war in the future? And what can we do now to prevent that mindset, in a sense that, you know, this is something that, again, forecasting, we have to think about in the future. What will war look like in the future, and how can we prevent it already now, the mindset to go to war?
I think in terms of lethal autonomous systems, this raises so many questions, but particularly in terms of relations between the North and South. So if we think about some of the major conflicts that have happened over the last 20 years, Afghanistan, one of the longest wars in recent history, how might that have been transformed if we'd had lethal autonomous systems? I think potentially worryingly, these systems give countries the ability to intervene elsewhere at relatively low cost. And because we know that actually, in terms of politics, in terms of culture, one of the brakes on intervention is that after a certain period of time, democracies in particular, but actually all countries, begin to tire of prolonged conflict. And that's to do with casualties, it's to do with cost, it's to do with boots on the ground. If we replace boots on the ground with autonomous systems, what does that mean in terms of civil-military relations? Again, this is asking some of the really big, I mean, you talked about Clausewitz, you know, it takes us back absolutely to some of the really profound questions about the relation between war, politics, and society.
Thank you. And I know you want to chime in on this as well.
Yeah, so well, in the book, we talk about that because obviously when you're using technological surrogate and surrogate in general, you are in a way getting rid of the relationship between the population and the effectors. So in the past it was soldier, and in conscription system, soldier were also part of the population that voted for the government. So you raise a huge question of accountability here and oversight. But I think before being too scared about a machine taken over and be, you know, having robots fighting on our behalf, what we will witness, and we're already witnessing, is, you know, this combination of really low technology with, you know, emerging technology. And what we are seeing now, be it in Gaza, be it in Ukraine, is the huge asymmetry between legacy system. You know, think about F-35, for instance, how much it cost, and then you look at the latest attack of Iran against Israel. You know, how much it cost for the defender to defend, because when you use saturation strategy, in the case of Israel with 230 ballistic missiles and drones that were launched, 5 went through. But for every missile that has been intercepted, the cost ratio between the missile that is attacking and the defender's missile is huge. So in a way, you could think about getting in a situation when you exhaust your adversary by the sheer numbers of low-cost systems that you send at him and its ability to counter them. So, the whole questions about, developing new aircraft carriers, if you think about how much it costs, and if you think now about, for instance, what the Ukrainians have done, think about that. The Ukrainians are managing to undermine the Russian fleet in the Black Sea without having a navy, just using drones. So that should force us to rethink, the traditional dynamics that we are thinking about when we're thinking about offense-defense balance in the military.
Thank you for highlighting that. And specifically, there were 2 drones, actually. They were both priced, I think, at $250,000. And they took down a $700 million ship. So again, like this kind of numbers is extraordinary. So I wanted to open the floor to questions. I think a lot of you have been very patient to not be able to ask a question yet, but please go ahead if you want to ask a question, and if you want, you can tell us your name. If you don't want to tell us your name, that's fine as well. So please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Wahid from Afghanistan, and a recent GCSP mass graduate. I have 2 questions. Should I use the mic or?
No, you can just speak freely. We have opened them.
2 questions for both the speakers. First, I really enjoyed it. The first question is about the disparity of the global South and North, which I'm really interested in that. From your perspective, what is your advice for the big role players to address this dilemma? And what will be the consequences if that left unaddressed in short and mid-term? And from Jean-Marc, the issue that he raised, which we feel it much in the global health arena as well, is the single-minded, linear thinkers, especially those researchers, which I really appreciate their knowledge, focus with their laptops in a corner in a silo, but unable to grasp the big picture. What is your advice, both at the technical level and for leadership level? Thank you.
So I think these are these are great. These are great questions, and the problems that we confront here in terms of technology in the global South are not new ones, as we know. The world has been worrying about the global information inequality for over 50 years, and what we need to do is stop this from getting worse. So I would argue that with these with all technologies, the World Bank, the UN has tended to see technology as a panacea for issues in the global South. And what we've tended to see is the UN and the World Bank buying things from high-tech companies designed for the North, and kind of, frankly, copied and pasted onto the global South. They're often inappropriate, they're often expensive, they don't work well, and then countries in the global South borrow money to pay for these systems. So we need more, if you like, we need systems that are designed by and more focused on issues of the global South. Just to introduce a little bit of optimism, I can be optimistic if you encourage me. I mean, there are countries that are really doing some fantastic work. Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa. Just taking Africa as an example. There are some really world-leading countries pushing ahead. So we have the capacity. What we need to do is involve those countries. Brazil's also been very active. Involve those countries in the conversation, but also in the design of these systems from the very outset.
Thank you. Did you want to?
Yeah, just on this question of disparity, I think that the actors that are able to develop this technology are only a handful because it requires enormous capabilities. But what we see is that once this technology is being developed or they are developed, they democratize very quickly and they proliferate very quickly. And so actors that were not traditionally endowed with a strong industrial base are able to actually piggyback on that. If you take Turkey, for instance, Turkey has now a name in terms of the drones development. Obviously, Israel now, Ukraine also in terms of drone development. Your other questions regarding what should we do in terms of how can we actually try to avoid this style of thinking. I think we need people that are hyper specialists, but I think that over time, academia has also forgotten about creating people that are able to grasp global problems, and it has to do probably with the incentive structure in academia, if you want to be promoted in academia, it's about publish or perish. It's about your publication record. And if your publication record is in different fields, it's almost impossible to get promoted. So we should change that by having curriculum that are a bit more generalist, but that are promoting people that are also able to think about ethics, because more and more of this technology are raising ethical issues that probably we've never been confronted with in the past. We see increasingly we are merging human beings with the machine, and that leads to huge ethical concern and issues that what does that mean to be human? For instance, we talk a lot about the conscience. What is to be conscious, and the whole issue of healing by a machine, meaningful human control over these weapons. These are issues that you cannot answer by quantitative analysis. It has to be qualitative. And the end, it's about values. And so maybe we should inject more of this into the curriculum of engineers and scientists. And likewise, if people in humanities, social sciences should also have a better background in science and math to be able not to solve equation, but at least to understand how this technology are working, what they are able to do, but also what are not able to do. Also to avoid the buzz, because there is nothing more damaging than you might be aware of the Gardner curves. So when technology evolves, you have a first peak, which is the hype, and then it goes down, and then you have a second curve. And so what tends to happen is that governments will actually regulate at the top of the hype. And by doing that, you can stifle innovation, all right? When your expectation of what could happen are completely overblown compared to what it can do. So there is also an indication there in terms of policymakers to have.
Thank you so much. And did you understand that?
Yes, so do you want me to read the question out?
Yes, sure, please. This is from online. We got a question.
Okay, so online question. Is it not too late now to request a moratorium when literacy in the United States and Europe is already at an all-time low and the damage to public discourse and societal cohesion has already been done? So this is probably my point about a possible 10-year moratorium. Well, I admit that I don't expect that to happen. But I do think we need to have a discussion about this because the alternative, which is piecemeal regulation, is something which I think is increasingly difficult to achieve. And it's not just about, it's easy to kind of blame technology for everything and say, oh, technology is moving too fast to regulate. It's not just about technology, it's also about the nature of our international system. So we've moved from a relatively unipolar system in the 1990s when regulating technology was quite relatively straightforward. There's quite a lot of consensus around regulation of the internet, the early part, the very first years of this century, produced the Budapest Convention on cybercrime. 20 years later, we're now in a much more conflicted international situation, where negotiating regulation about anything to do with technology is increasingly difficult. So I still think to some extent a moratorium would be relatively straightforward. And perhaps the easiest thing to implement. Policing it, doing verification on that, as Jean-Marc says, would be perhaps pretty challenging, but I still think it's possible.
Thank you so much. I'm going to now wrap up. I just wanted to highlight some of the points I think that came out. One of them was the delay, detect, and defend. We need to protect against this coming wave of technology. We have to ensure that the people who create the technology are responsible, that they build appropriate controls into the technology from the start. We have to align businesses and organizations with responsible technology and containment and work with government officials. We need to create alliances, not only with other governments, but also amongst academics, and create a culture not only of sharing and learning, but also of the failures of some of the technologies that we create, but also the importance of ethics, to understand how to create ethical technology. And also at the outset, build in the public, make the people understand, create a pressure on them to understand the technologies so that they aren't fooled by these technologies, especially the misinformation, disinformation that can really dramatically change our democracies and our global security. So thank you so much. I wanted to thank all of you here for coming. We were delighted to have this course attend today. And I wanted also to thank everyone behind the scenes, Florian Gollet, Alexandre Bouvet, Bérangère Bartholomé, for their help in getting you all here. I wish all of you online also, thank you so much for being with us, and I wish you all a nice summer. This will be our last Geneva Security Debate until September. So in the meantime, I wish you all a very healthy and happy summer, and try to get a little technological break somewhere in there so that you can enjoy the beautiful mountains here in Switzerland and hopefully get enough strength to go back to work in the fall. So we'll all see you back in September, hopefully. It's the 30th of September, so thank you. And before we completely end this session, I want to thank the panelists, Jean-Marc and Professor Richard Aldrich, for their incredible incisive thoughts. And I hope you have a lot of food for thought for the week ahead of you here at your course. And I wish you all a lovely afternoon. Thank you so much.